Neighbors laughed at the trench around her cabin, until their floors froze and hers stayed warm northern Minnesota, winter of 1959. When Alina Whitfield dug a deep trench all the way around her small log cabin just before the first snowfall, people didn't just question her judgment. They laughed openly. From the road, it looked like she'd trapped her own house in a frozen moat. Some said it would fill with ice. Others said it would collapse her foundation. One neighbor joked that she was trying to drain the cold straight into her floorboards. Alina didn't respond. She'd already lived through 2 winters where frost climbed up through the floor faster than her stove could fight it. She knew the fire wasn't the real problem. The ground was. When January temperatures dropped below 0 and stayed there, cabins across the township grew unlivable from the bottom up. Floors hardened with ice. Beds felt like stone. People slept with boots on just to keep circulation in their feet. But something strange happened at Alina's place. While others stamped their feet against frozen planks, her cabin stayed warm, quietly, consistently, starting from the ground itself. If you want one real winter survival method each week, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Northern Minnesota, late November 1959. The pines outside Itasca County stood like dark needles against a sky that already looked like steel. The lakes hadn't frozen over yet, but the shallows had skimmed with ice, and the first hard wind had that clean, sharp bite that told everyone the same thing. Once winter settled in, it wouldn't loosen its grip until spring. That was when Alina Whitfield started digging. Her cabin sat on the edge of a tamarack bog, a half-mile off the gravel road, where the ground stayed damp even in summer and turned stubbornly cold the moment temperatures dropped. The cabin wasn't grand. 2 rooms, tight spruce logs, a potbelly stove in the center, and a plank floor that creaked like old bones. It was the kind of place people built because they could, not because it was easy. Alina was 46, widowed 3 years, and known in the township as someone who didn't waste words. She worked in town as a cook and cleaned cabins for extra money, then spent summers fixing up her own place board by board. She didn't talk about hardship like it was a badge. She treated it like weather, something you planned for and got through. The year before, winter had nearly beaten her, not with storms or snowdrifts, but from below. By mid-January, her floor had turned into a sheet of cold that no stove could overpower. She could keep the air warm enough to breathe comfortably, but her feet stayed numb no matter how close she sat to the fire. Water left in a bucket overnight formed ice at the top, even in the middle of the room. Some mornings, she stepped out of bed and felt the cold climb up through her legs like it was alive. She tried the usual fixes: extra rugs, straw mats. More wood in the stove. Nothing changed. The heat rose, collected near the ceiling, and disappeared. The cold stayed where it always stayed, down low where people lived. That memory sat in her bones when the first frosts returned. So instead of cutting more firewood or patching more cracks in the walls, Alina went outside with a spade, a pick, and a wheelbarrow and began carving a trench around her cabin. At first, neighbors assumed she was fixing drainage. Then they saw how deep she went. The trench ran in a neat rectangle, 3 feet out from the cabin walls, and it kept going down until Alina's boots were below the level of the cabin floor. In places, it was nearly 4 feet deep, a dark cut in pale soil that looked like a moat waiting to fill with ice. People stopped to watch. Harold Sutter, who lived 2 properties down and considered himself handy, leaned on his truck door and called out, "You know that's gonna cave in once the ground freezes, right?" Alina kept digging. At the small general store in Marcel, the talk grew sharper. "She's trying to drain the cold away," one man joked. "More like she's digging her own grave," another replied to scattered laughter. Someone said the trench would collect snow and water, then freeze solid and push her foundation sideways. Someone else insisted it would become a rat highway straight into her cabin. Even the older women who were kinder in their words still said the same thing with their eyes. "Why would you do that to yourself right before winter?" Alina heard it all. She didn't answer because she wasn't building this for approval. She finished the trench in 3 days and lined the bottom with coarse gravel scavenged from the roadside. Then she laid rough planks across sections like narrow bridges, so she could still reach her woodpile and door without stepping down into the cut. Around the outside edge, she hammered in short stakes and stretched burlap panels as windbreaks, not to stop snow, but to keep the trench from filling too fast. From the road, it looked ridiculous. A cabin with a man-made ditch around it, like a fort from another century, only colder and lonelier. People drove past slower than usual, either laughing or quietly worried. Elinor didn't look up. She went inside, banked her stove, and kept working on small details, sealing the crawlspace vents, checking the foundation stones, making sure water would run away from the trench instead of toward it. Because she knew what was coming. The weather reports on the radio weren't casual anymore. The announcer in Bemidji warned of an Arctic push moving down from Canada. Week-long lows below zero, deep frost, and winds strong enough to turn fresh snow into hard-packed drifts. Old-timers in town said it had the feel of 1936. Elinor stood on her porch one evening and watched the sky fade into that flat, colorless gray that meant cold was about to take over. The trench around her cabin sat dark and quiet, already stiffening at the edges. Neighbors still thought it was foolish. But when the deep freeze arrived and cabins across the township began to harden from the bottom up, Elinor Whitfield's strange trench was about to be judged by the only thing that mattered in Minnesota winter. Not opinions. Results. People blamed frozen floors on thin boards, poor craftsmanship, or a stove that wasn't big enough. They were wrong. Floors froze first because heat didn't escape cabins the way people imagined it did. Heat didn't just rise, it bled downward. In northern Minnesota, winter didn't stop at the walls. It came up through the ground itself. Once frost drove deep enough into the soil, the earth beneath a cabin became a cold reservoir that never slept. Every hour of sub-zero air pulled more warmth out of the ground. And once the soil froze solid, it began stealing heat from anything touching it. That included floors. A stove could keep the air warm enough to breathe. It could even make a room feel comfortable from the waist up. But the moment that warmth reached the floor, it vanished. Heat conducted straight through planks, joists, and foundation stones and disappeared into frozen soil below. That was why people complained their feet never warmed. They weren't imagining it. The floor was acting like a drain. In most cabins, the foundation was little more than stacked stone or short piers set directly into the earth. Crawl spaces were shallow and poorly sealed. Some had vents meant for summer airflow that became winter highways for cold. Once frost penetrated beneath the cabin, the ground stayed frozen for months, even during brief warm spells. The stove fought air temperature. The ground fought everything else. That mismatch exhausted people. They burned more wood trying to compensate. They kept fires roaring hotter and longer, thinking more heat would solve the problem. Instead, it made the contrast worse. Hot air pooled near the ceiling while the floor stayed brutally cold. The greater the temperature difference, the faster heat moved downward. It was physics working quietly against them. Frost heave made it worse. As soil froze, moisture inside it expanded. That expansion lifted and shifted foundation stones unevenly, opening gaps that pulled in even more cold air. Those gaps weren't obvious at first. They formed below the floor, out of sight, where no one noticed until the chill crept upward and refused to leave. Cabins built on damp ground suffered the most. Water-saturated soil froze deeper and harder than dry soil. The tamarack bog near Elinor Whitfield's cabin was notorious for it. In winter, the ground turned into a solid block that held cold the way iron held heat. Once frozen, it stayed that way until spring came in force. People tried insulating above the floor. Rugs, straw, extra planks. All of it helped a little, but none of it addressed the real problem. The cold wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from contact. Every joist touching frozen ground became a bridge for heat to escape. Every stone foundation block acted like a wick, drawing warmth down and away. As long as the ground stayed frozen directly beneath the cabin, the floor never stood a chance. That was the part Elinor understood. She didn't come to it through theory. She came to it through memory. The winter before, she'd noticed something strange during a brief January thaw. The air warmed slightly for 2 days. The stove worked less hard, and for the first time in weeks the floor felt almost tolerable, not warm but no longer punishing. Then the cold returned. Within a day, the floor froze again. The air changed quickly. The ground did not. That delay told her everything. If she could stop the ground beneath her cabin from freezing as deeply, or at least separate it from the soil around it, the floor might hold warmth long enough to matter. But how did you stop the earth from freezing in Minnesota, Winter? You didn't. You broke the connection. That was what the trench was for. By cutting a deep gap around the cabin, Elinor wasn't trying to drain cold away. She was interrupting the path heat took as it escaped. Frozen soil outside the trench could not easily pull warmth from soil inside it. The air gap acted as a thermal break, a barrier that slowed conduction dramatically. Cold soil met air instead of more soil, and air, when still, was a poor conductor of heat. The trench did another thing people didn't consider. It kept surface frost from creeping inward. In winter, frost didn't freeze the ground evenly from top to bottom. It advanced from the surface downward and sideways, following moisture and contact. By removing soil near the foundation and replacing it with air and gravel, Elinor gave frost less material to travel through. It still froze the exposed edges of the trench, but it slowed before reaching the cabin itself. Drainage mattered too. Frozen, wet soil stole more heat than frozen, dry soil. Elinor's gravel base allowed meltwater and seepage to drain away instead of pooling near the foundation. Less moisture meant less ice, and less ice meant less cold stored directly under the floor. None of this was common knowledge. People focused on walls because walls were visible. They patched cracks, stacked insulation, and built windbreaks. Floors were out of sight, out of mind, until winter reminded them how much they mattered. That was why Elinor's trench looked absurd. It didn't add warmth, it didn't block wind. It didn't glow with fire or promise comfort at a glance. It just sat there, open and exposed, doing something most people couldn't see. It was slowing heat loss at the one place no one else bothered to look. As the ground temperature dropped deeper each night, cabins across the township hardened from the bottom up. Floors became slabs of cold that refused to warm. People started sleeping with boots on. Children woke with numb toes. Chairs left in one spot felt like ice blocks by morning. Elinor watched the frost line inch downward along the edges of her trench. She measured it with a stick. She felt the soil near her foundation each morning. It stayed colder than she liked, but not as cold as it should have been. Inside, the stove didn't have to fight as hard. The air warmed faster. More importantly, the warmth lasted longer. Heat that would normally vanish into the ground lingered just enough to change how the cabin felt. Not hot, but habitable. And as the weather forecasts grew more ominous, longer stretches below zero, deeper frost, harder ground, the question wasn't whether Elinor's trench looked foolish anymore. The question was whether it would hold when winter pressed hardest. Because if it failed, the cold wouldn't arrive gently. It would come up through the floor all at once, and when that happened, there would be no arguing with it. The Arctic front arrived in mid-January like a door slamming shut. There was no gentle lead-in, no gradual slide into colder nights. One afternoon, the sky cleared hard and bright, and by nightfall, the temperature dropped faster than anyone expected. Radios in Itasca County warned of sustained lows below zero for at least 10 days, with nighttime readings pushing toward -20. Old men at the store stopped arguing about it and started counting what they had left. By the second morning, frost had driven deep enough to turn exposed ground into iron. Cabins across the township responded the way they always did, by burning harder. Stoves roared from before dawn until long after dark. Chimneys smoked thick and constant, a sign not of comfort but desperation. Heat rose, pooled near ceilings, and vanished. Cold crept upward from the floor and refused to leave. By day 3, people stopped taking their boots off indoors. At Harold Sutter's place, the floor near the door froze so hard that spilled water shattered instead of spreading. His wife laid down every rug they owned and still slept with her feet wrapped in wool and burlap. In the mornings, they lit the stove and waited, sometimes hours, for the room to feel human again. 2 houses down, a family with small children nailed scrap boards over their plank floor and packed straw between the layers. It helped for a day. Then the straw froze, too. The ground was winning. That was what people didn't like to say out loud. In Minnesota winter, you weren't fighting air. You were fighting the earth itself. Once frost locked into the soil, it became a cold engine that ran non-stop, pulling warmth out of anything resting on it. By the 4th day, frost depth reports came in from the county office. In open areas, the freeze had driven down more than 3 feet. In damp ground near bogs, it went deeper. That put Alina Whitfield's cabin squarely in danger. Neighbors expected her trench to fail first. They imagined the exposed soil collapsing inward, reconnecting frozen ground directly to her foundation. They imagined the trench filling with ice and acting like a frozen collar around the cabin, worse than before. So when the temperature dropped to -14 overnight and stayed below 0 all day, people started watching her place more closely. What they noticed didn't match expectations. Alina's chimney smoked, but lightly, not the thick, desperate plume pouring out of most houses. Just a steady thread like early December instead of mid-January. More telling was what they didn't see. She wasn't chopping wood constantly. Her woodpile shrank, but slowly. Inside her cabin, Alina moved normally. She sat at the table without keeping her feet tucked under her chair. She cooked without standing directly against the stove. At night, she slept without boots on, her feet under a single blanket instead of 3. The thermometer near her floor told the story she'd hoped for but didn't fully believe until she saw it. While neighbors measured floor temperatures in the low 30s, or worse, the planks beneath Alina's feet stayed just above 40. Not warm, but not freezing, not sucking heat out of her body the moment she touched them. That difference changed everything. Heat from the stove now stayed in the room long enough to matter. The cabin warmed evenly instead of stratifying. The air didn't feel top-heavy and hollow. It felt balanced. The trench was holding. Outside, frost pressed inward relentlessly. Alina checked the trench twice a day, sometimes 3 times. She knocked away ice forming on the outer walls. She cleared drifted snow where it melted and refroze into slick sheets. She kept the gravel bed exposed and draining. The inner soil wall, the side closest to her foundation, froze slower. By day 6, the contrast was obvious even to people who didn't want to believe it. At Mrs. Havorson's place, 2 miles away, the family gave up on heating the back room entirely. The floor there had frozen solid. The children slept in the kitchen, where the stove was, and still woke with numb feet. At Alina's cabin, the back corner stayed usable. On day 7, County Extension Agent Paul Carney drove out to check on isolated residents. He carried a clipboard and a pocket thermometer, the same one he used to log barn temperatures and frost damage reports. He didn't expect much from Alina's place. He'd heard the jokes. He'd seen the trench once and thought it was unnecessary at best, dangerous at worst. Still, he stopped. He stepped onto her porch and paused. The boards didn't feel like ice. Inside, the temperature at chest height read 64. That wasn't unusual. What caught his attention was the reading near the floor. 43. Carney crouched, pressed his hand to the planks, and frowned. "How long's it been like this?" he asked. "All week," Alina said. He stepped outside, walked the trench, and knelt at the gravel bed. He probed the inner soil wall with a metal rod. It was frozen, but not as deeply as the ground beyond the trench. He stood up slowly. "You've broken the frost path," he said, more to himself than to her. That afternoon, the temperature fell again. By nightfall, it hit -19. That was when things began to fail elsewhere. A stone foundation collapsed partially at one cabin where frost heave lifted and shifted blocks unevenly. Cold air poured in through the gap, turning the floor into ice within hours. Another family lost their stove draft when the chimney iced over. Smoke backed up into the room, forcing them to kill the fire and retreat to one corner with blankets. Alina slept through the night. She woke before dawn, fed the stove lightly, and sat at the table with her feet on the floor, listening to the quiet creak of timber as the cabin adjusted to the cold. The trench did its work invisibly. Cold outside pushed against frozen soil. That soil met air. The air met gravel. The gravel met soil that was no longer directly connected to the cold mass beyond. Each step weakened the transfer. By day 10, the deep freeze had broken records. Official readings from Bemidji showed 10 consecutive days below zero, with 5 nights colder than -15. Frost depth measurements exceeded averages by nearly a foot. Cabins without mitigation froze from below. People adapted in ways that spoke to exhaustion rather than ingenuity. They slept in shifts to keep fires going. They burned furniture. They closed off rooms permanently. At Aliner's place, the stove burned steadily but modestly. Her woodpile was half what it had been at the start of the cold snap. Neighbors noticed that too. On day 12, Harold Sutter walked over, stamping his feet against the cold. He stood on Aliner's floor and said nothing for a long moment. "It ain't warm," he said finally. "No," Aliner replied, "but it ain't killing me." She nodded. That was the point. When the Arctic front finally loosened its grip and temperatures crawled back towards single digits, the damage across the township became clear. Frozen pipes, heaved foundations, exhausted families. Aliner's cabin needed none of that repaired. Her floor never froze solid. Her foundation stones stayed put. Her stove never had to fight a losing battle. The trench hadn't made her cabin warm, it had made it winnable. As people emerged and compared notes, the laughter stopped entirely. No one called the trench foolish anymore, they called it lucky. But Aliner knew better. Luck didn't hold for 12 days of deep freeze. Attention did. And when winter tested every assumption people had about heat, ground, and survival, it wasn't the biggest stove or thickest walls that made the difference. It was the small, ridiculous-looking cut in the earth that broke the cold's easiest path, and quietly kept a cabin livable when the ground itself turned against everything built on it. When the deep freeze finally released its grip on northern Minnesota, it didn't arrive with relief so much as exhaustion. People didn't celebrate warmer days. They assessed damage. They counted losses. They took stock of what had broken and what had barely held together. That was when Aliner Whitfield's trench stopped being a curiosity and started becoming a reference point. No one announced it. No meeting was called. The shift happened the way practical knowledge always spreads in hard places, quietly, through observation and repetition. The first to act was Harold Sutter. In early February, while frost still sat heavy in the ground, he dug a shallow trench along the north and west sides of his cabin. Not as deep as Aliner's, not as clean, but enough to break contact between frozen soil and his foundation stones. He lined it with gravel and left it open, just as he'd seen her do. Within days, he noticed a difference. His floor didn't warm up. But it stopped getting worse. The cold slowed. The stove held the room longer after each feeding. He told no one at first, but others noticed his chimney smoking less. 2 more cabins followed. One family dug trenches only along the windward sides of their house where frost hit hardest. Another extended their crawl space and packed the soil away from the foundation, creating a partial air gap. None of these matched Aliner's setup exactly. They didn't need to. The principle was enough. Break the ground contact, slow the frost, let the heat you make stay where you need it. By March, when the sun finally gained strength and snow softened during the day, conversations at the store changed. People talked about floors now, about ground, about how cold really moved. They talked less about stoves. County Extension Agent Paul Carney included a short note in his spring report, nothing dramatic. Just a paragraph on ground isolation methods for winter cabins, with a brief mention of trenching and air gaps as experimental but promising techniques for frost-heavy regions. He didn't name Aliner. He didn't need to. Everyone knew where it had started. Aliner didn't charge for advice. She didn't mind when people walked her perimeter or asked questions. She explained what she could and warned about what could go wrong. She was clear about one thing above all. "You can't dig it and forget it," she said. "Winter doesn't let you." The trench required care. Drainage had to be maintained. Snow had to be managed. Soil shifts had to be watched. It wasn't a trick. It was a system that demanded attention in exchange for reliability. People respected that. By the next winter, at least 6 cabins in the township had some form of ground break around them. None looked identical. Some were deeper, some shallower, some only partial. But all shared the same quiet goal, keeping floors from becoming the coldest part of the house. The results were consistent. Wood piles lasted longer, mornings were less brutal, people stopped sleeping in boots. Children played on floors again without their breath fogging the air. Alina's cabin didn't change, the trench stayed, the routine stayed. She maintained it each fall and spring, adjusted it as the ground shifted, and trusted it the way she trusted the stove, not as magic, but as something that worked when respected. Years later, when someone new moved into the area and asked about the odd trenches around certain cabins, old-timers explained it simply. "Ground gets cold before the air," they said. "If you don't stop it, it'll take your heat whether you like it or not." Alina Whitfield never claimed she'd invented anything. She didn't talk about physics or theory. She talked about watching what failed and refusing to repeat it. Her trench didn't make winter gentle, it made it manageable. And that distinction mattered more than comfort. Because in places where cold arrived every year without asking permission, survival wasn't about bravado or tradition. It was about paying attention to the quiet parts of a problem, the ones everyone else ignored because they were inconvenient or ugly or didn't look like progress. The trench around Alina's cabin never became standard building practice. Most people preferred insulation and bigger stoves when they could afford them. But the idea never disappeared either. Whenever floors froze faster than walls, someone remembered it. Whenever frost heaved cracked foundations, someone suggested breaking the soil contact. And whenever someone laughed at a solution that didn't look impressive, someone else remembered a winter when laughter stopped and results spoke instead. The trench stayed where Alina dug it, a narrow scar in the earth that winter couldn't easily cross. It didn't shine. It didn't burn. It didn't promise anything loudly. It just worked. And in northern Minnesota, where winter respected only what held, that was the highest praise a thing could earn.